They claimed her Warthog was too slow. Then she forced two stealth jets to retreat alone. Captain Sarah Tank Mitchell gripped the stick of her. Thunderbolt II as she taxied down the runway at Nellie's Air Force Base. The morning sun painted the Nevada desert in shades of gold and amber, but her mind was focused on the conversation she'd overheard in the briefing room just hours earlier. "The Warthog is obsolete," Major Richards had said, his voice carrying the arrogance that seemed to follow F-22 pilots like their own shadow. "In a real fight, those slow, ugly birds would be sitting ducks. Modern warfare is about speed and stealth, not flying tanks from the Cold War era." The words still stung. Sarah had been flying the A-10 for 8 years, and she knew her aircraft better than she knew her own heartbeat. The Thunderbolt II, affectionately called the Warthog by those who flew it, wasn't built for beauty or speed. It was built to survive, to protect ground troops, and to accomplish missions that sleeker aircraft couldn't handle. Today's exercise was supposed to be routine air-to-air combat training between different aircraft types. The brass had organized it as part of their ongoing evaluation of the Air Force's aging fleet. With budget cuts looming and politicians questioning the relevance of older platforms, every sortie felt like an audition for survival. Sarah's wingman, Captain Jake Bulldog Torres, pulled his A-10 alongside hers as they approached the runway threshold. Through her canopy, she could see him give her a thumbs up. They'd been flying together for 3 years, and their partnership had become legendary among ground support circles. When Marines called for close air support, they specifically requested Tank and Bulldog. "Tower Hog flight ready for departure," Sarah radioed, using the call sign assigned to their two-ship formation. "Hog flight cleared for takeoff. Good hunting out there." The twin General Electric TF-34 engines spooled up with their characteristic whistle, and Sarah felt the familiar sensation of controlled power beneath her. The A-10 wasn't fast by modern standards, maxing out at around 450 miles per hour, but what it lacked in speed, it made up for in other ways. As they climbed to their assigned altitude of 15,000 feet, Sarah reviewed the mission parameters. They would be operating in the Red Flag training area, a vast expanse of Nevada desert that served as one of the world's most realistic combat training environments. Their opponents today were two F-22 Raptors, the Air Force's premier air superiority fighters, piloted by Major Richards and Captain Davis. The F-22 was everything the A-10 wasn't. Stealthy, supersonic, and armed with the most advanced air-to-air missiles in the American arsenal. On paper, it was no contest. The Raptor could engage targets from beyond visual range, using its sophisticated radar and stealth capabilities to remain undetected until it was too late for its enemies to respond. But Sarah knew something that the fighter jocks often forgot. Real combat wasn't fought on paper, and the A-10 had been designed by people who understood that battles were won by pilots who could think, adapt, and use every advantage their aircraft possessed. "Hog 1, Bulldog," Jake's voice crackled through her headset. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "If you're thinking these Raptor guys are about to learn why we're still flying after 40 years, then yeah," Sarah replied. The A-10's reputation as a ground attack aircraft was well-deserved. Its 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon could destroy tanks, its titanium bathtub could withstand massive damage, and its redundant systems meant it could keep flying even after taking hits that would down other aircraft. But what many people didn't realize was that the Warthog had been designed during an era when air-to-air combat was still expected to include close-range engagements. The aircraft's relatively tight turning radius, excellent low-speed handling, and robust construction made it surprisingly capable in a dogfight, especially if the pilot knew how to exploit its unique characteristics. Sarah had spent years studying the tactics of A-10 pilots who had scored air-to-air kills during the Gulf War and other conflicts. She knew the theory. Today, she might get a chance to prove it worked in practice. "Hog flight, this is Red Crown," the exercise controller's voice broke into her thoughts. "Your opponents are airborne and proceeding to the exercise area. Rules of engagement are in effect. Simulate weapons only, maintain safe separation, and remember this is training. Have fun out there." Sarah checked her aircraft systems one more time. The ALQ-131 electronic countermeasures pod was functioning normally, though it was hardly state-of-the-art compared to the sophisticated electronic warfare systems on the F-22. Her radar warning receiver was active, ready to alert her to incoming threats. Most importantly, her eyes were scanning the sky, because in the end, The most important sensor was still the human brain interpreting what the human eye could see. "Bulldog, let's spread out and use the terrain," Sarah transmitted. "These guys are going to be looking for us with their fancy radars, but they can't shoot what they can't see." The Nevada desert below them was far from flat and empty. Mountain ranges created valleys and canyons that could mask aircraft from radar detection. The irregular terrain also created thermal layers and atmospheric disturbances that could interfere with missile tracking systems. Sarah descended toward the deck, dropping her A-10 to barely 200 feet above the desert floor. At this altitude, her aircraft's heat signature would be partially masked by the warm desert ground, and the terrain would help break up her radar cross-section. The F-22s, operating at higher altitudes to maximize their radar coverage, would have to work harder to detect and track her. "Contact," Jake called out. "Bearcat 270 high about 20 miles out." Sarah looked in the direction Jake had indicated and caught a glint of sunlight off metal. The F-22s were approaching from the west, probably at around 25,000 feet, using their altitude advantage to look down at the exercise area. "I see them," Sarah confirmed. "Hog 2, let's show these boys what 40 years of evolution looks like." The opening moves of the engagement were about to begin, and Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with aerial combat, even in a training environment. The Raptor pilots thought they knew how this would go. They were about to discover that experience and tactical thinking could overcome technological superiority, especially when that technology was operated by pilots who had never faced an opponent quite like the A-10 Warthog. Major Kevin Richards adjusted his grip on the F-22's stick as he scanned the tactical display in front of him. Flying at 28,000 feet, he had what should have been a commanding view of the battlefield below. His Raptor's AN/APG-77 radar was one of the most advanced systems ever installed in a fighter aircraft, capable of tracking multiple targets simultaneously while remaining virtually undetectable to enemy sensors. "Viper 2, Viper 1, he transmitted to his wingman, Captain Mike Davis. "I'm not seeing much down there. These warthogs must be hiding in the weeds." Richards had participated in dozens of air-to-air exercises, and they usually followed a predictable pattern. His radar would detect the enemy aircraft at long range. He would lock them up with AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles, and the engagement would be over before the opponents knew what hit them. The F-22's stealth characteristics meant that most enemy aircraft couldn't detect him until they were well within his missile range. But today felt different. The two A-10s that were supposed to be operating in the exercise area seemed to have vanished. His radar showed empty sky where he expected to see the distinctive signatures of the twin-engine attack aircraft. "Maybe they turned around and went home," Captain Davis suggested with a chuckle. "Those old birds probably realized they were outmatched before the fight even started." Richards wasn't so sure. He'd heard stories about A-10 pilots, and while he considered their aircraft obsolete, he had to admit that the people who flew them were known for their tenacity. During the Gulf War, Warthog pilots had actually scored several air-to-air kills against Iraqi helicopters and even a few fixed-wing aircraft. Of course, those had been against outdated Soviet-era planes flown by poorly trained pilots, not modern American fighters with experienced crews. "Viper 1, this is Red Crown," the exercise controller's voice crackled through his headset. "Be advised, hog flight is active in your area. They may be using terrain masking and low-altitude tactics." Richards rolled his eyes. Terrain masking was a Cold War tactic that had limited effectiveness against modern radar systems. The F-22's radar could look down and track targets even when they were flying close to the ground. The Doppler processing capabilities of his system could distinguish between moving aircraft and stationary terrain features. "Copy Red Crown, beginning descent to investigate." Richards pushed his stick forward and felt the Raptor respond instantly. The aircraft dove toward the exercise area at nearly twice the speed of sound, its engines barely registering on infrared detectors thanks to sophisticated heat signature reduction technology. At this speed, he could cover the entire exercise area in minutes. As he descended through 20,000 feet, his radar finally started picking up contacts. But something was strange about the returns. Instead of the clear, steady blips he expected from aircraft flying predictable patterns, he was seeing intermittent contacts that appeared and disappeared seemingly at random. "Viper 2, you seeing this?" he asked his wingman. Yeah, boss, looks like they're playing games with us, popping up and disappearing, probably using terrain features to break radar lock. Richards had to admit he was impressed. The A-10 pilots were clearly more tactically sophisticated than he'd given them credit for. They were using the mountainous Nevada terrain like submarine commanders used thermoclines in the ocean, ducking behind ridgelines and into valleys to mask their movements. But terrain masking was a defensive tactic. Eventually, the A-10s would have to expose themselves to engage, and when they did, the superior speed and firepower of the F-22s would end the exercise quickly. Viper 1 contact bearing 180 low about 8 miles, Davis called out. Richards looked at his display and saw it too. One of the A-10s had emerged from behind a ridgeline and was flying north at low level. The aircraft appeared to be alone, which surprised Richards. Most A-10 operations involved two-ship formations for mutual support. "I've got him," Richards confirmed, moving to intercept. The F-22 pilot rolled his aircraft toward the target and began a diving attack. His plan was simple: use his speed advantage to close the distance quickly, simulate a missile shot, and then climb back to altitude before the A-10 could respond. The Warthog's maximum speed of 450 miles per hour meant it couldn't run away, and its limited air-to-air weaponry meant it couldn't effectively fight back. But as Richards descended toward the target, something unexpected happened. The A-10 suddenly pulled into a tight left turn, disappearing behind another ridgeline. Richards found himself overshooting the target area, his superior speed now working against him. "Damn it," he muttered, pulling back on the stick to avoid flying into the mountainside. The F-22 climbed rapidly, its powerful engines easily overcoming gravity. But by the time Richards had regained enough altitude to safely maneuver, the A-10 had vanished again. "Viper 1, Viper 2, Davis called. "I think I know what they're doing. They're using hit-and-run tactics. Pop up, draw us down low, then disappear before we can get a shot." Richards realized his wingman was right. The A-10 pilots were fighting smart, using their aircraft's strengths while avoiding situations where the F-22's advantages would be decisive. At low altitude and low speed, the Warthog's excellent maneuverability became much more relevant, while the Raptor's speed and radar advantages were diminished. "New plan," Richards decided. "We stay high and wait for them to make a mistake. They can't hide forever." But even as he spoke the words, Richards felt a nagging doubt. The A-10 pilots seemed to know exactly what they were doing, and they were clearly prepared for a long, patient engagement. This wasn't going to be the quick, decisive victory he had expected. Down in the valleys below, Sarah Mitchell was executing a plan she had developed during years of studying air-to-air combat between dissimilar aircraft types. The key was to negate the F-22's advantages while maximizing her own aircraft's strengths. Speed and stealth were powerful weapons, but they weren't the only factors that determined the outcome of aerial combat. The Raptor pilots were learning that lesson the hard way. Their technological superiority was meaningless if they couldn't bring their weapons to bear on targets that refused to fight on their terms, and Sarah was just getting started. Sarah tank, Mitchell kept her A-10 tucked into a narrow canyon, flying barely 50 feet above the rocky desert floor. Her aircraft's titanium armor was designed to withstand ground fire, but today it was serving another purpose entirely. The dense mineral content in the canyon walls was creating enough electromagnetic interference to make her aircraft's already small radar signature practically invisible to the sophisticated sensors above. "Bulldog, status report," she whispered into her microphone, keeping her voice low even though she knew the F-22 pilots couldn't hear her tactical frequency. "Copy, tank. I'm in the wash about 2 miles south of your position. These Raptor boys are getting frustrated up there. I can hear them chattering on guard frequency." Sarah smiled grimly. Jake had tuned one of his backup radios to the emergency frequency that all military aircraft monitored. It wasn't uncommon for pilots to accidentally transmit on guard during stressful situations, revealing more about their state of mind than they intended. The plan she and Jake were executing had been born from necessity during her early years flying the A-10. When your aircraft was slower and less sophisticated than almost everything else in the sky, you learned to fight with your brain instead of your technology. The Warthog pilots called it fighting like a cornered badger, using every trick, every advantage, no matter how small, to survive and win. "Tank, I've got movement," Jake reported. One of them just descended to about 15,000 feet, heading toward your last known position. Sarah checked her radar warning receiver. The device was primitive compared to the electronic warfare systems on modern fighters, but it was sensitive enough to detect when she was being painted by enemy radar. So far, it remained quiet, which meant the F-22s were still searching rather than tracking. Copy beginning next phase. Sarah pulled her A-10 into a climbing turn, bringing it up over the ridgeline and into the open sky. For a moment, her aircraft would be visible to anyone looking in the right direction, but that was exactly what she wanted. The key to her strategy was understanding how fighter pilots thought. Richards and Davis had been trained to engage targets at long range using beyond visual range missiles. They were accustomed to fights that lasted minutes, not hours. Their tactical doctrine assumed that stealth and speed would allow them to control the engagement from beginning to end. But Sarah was changing the rules. Instead of trying to match the F-22's strengths, she was forcing the Raptor pilots to fight her kind of battle: close range, low altitude, and extended duration. Every minute that passed without a decisive F-22 victory was a psychological victory for the A-10 crews. Contact, the voice belonged to Major Richards, broadcasting in the clear on the exercise frequency. A-10 in the open, bearing 45 from checkpoint Alpha, moving to engage. Sarah waited exactly 3 seconds before diving back toward the deck. The timing was critical. She needed to stay visible long enough for the F-22 to commit to an attack, but not long enough for the Raptor pilot to achieve a weapons solution. Behind her, she could hear the distinctive roar of the F-22's Pratt and Whitney engines as Richards dove toward her last known position. The Raptor pilot was probably pulling several GS in his descent, his aircraft's fly-by-wire flight controls automatically adjusting to maintain optimum performance. Sarah's A-10, meanwhile, was doing something the F-22 simply couldn't match. As she approached the canyon floor, she pulled the aircraft into an impossibly tight turn, bleeding off airspeed until she was flying barely above stall speed. The Warthog's straight wings and powerful control surfaces allowed it to maintain controlled flight at speeds that would send other aircraft tumbling toward the ground. "Damn it, where did she go?" Richard's voice carried frustration and a hint of anger. The F-22 pilot had committed to a high-speed diving attack, but his target had vanished just as he arrived in the engagement zone. Sarah knew exactly where Richards was now. The F-22's speed meant it couldn't stop or turn quickly at low altitude. The Raptor pilot would have to extend away from the target area, climb back to a safe altitude, and set up for another attack. That process would take several minutes, during which Sarah could move to a completely different location. "Bulldog, your turn," she transmitted. "Give our friend something to think about." "Roger that, tally-ho." Jake Torres brought his A-10 up from its hiding place in the desert wash, appearing suddenly on the opposite side of the exercise area. The second F-22, piloted by Captain Davis, immediately turned toward this new threat. But Jake had no intention of staying in the open any longer than absolutely necessary. His aircraft performed a diving spiral that would have been impossible for a faster, less maneuverable fighter. Within seconds, he had disappeared behind another ridgeline, leaving the F-22 pilot searching empty sky. "This is ridiculous," Davis transmitted, not bothering to mask his irritation. "These guys are playing hide and seek instead of fighting." Sarah almost laughed out loud. The F-22 pilots were discovering what ground forces had known for decades. The A-10 was nearly impossible to kill when flown by pilots who understood its capabilities. During the Gulf War, not a single Warthog had been lost to enemy fighters, despite operating in the most dangerous airspace of the conflict. But her amusement faded as she realized the F-22 pilots were adapting to her tactics. Instead of pursuing individual targets, they were beginning to coordinate their attacks, using their superior altitude and speed to cover multiple areas simultaneously. "Tank, heads up," Jake warned. "They're changing their approach. Both Raptors are staying high and spreading out. They're trying to box us in." Sarah nodded, even though her wingman couldn't see her. The F-22 pilots were learning, which meant the next phase of the engagement would be more dangerous. It was time to escalate her own tactics. "Copy, Bulldog. Time to show them what the Warthog was really designed for." The A-10 had been built during the height of the Cold War, when NATO planners expected massive tank battles on the plains of Europe. The aircraft's design philosophy emphasized survivability, firepower, and the ability to operate from damaged or improvised airfields. But those same characteristics that made it perfect for ground attack also gave it some unusual capabilities in air-to-air combat. Sarah began climbing toward the F-22s, her aircraft's nose pointed almost straight up. The maneuver seemed suicidal. She was deliberately exposing herself to the enemy fighters, giving up the terrain masking that had protected her so far. But appearance could be deceiving. The A-10 climbing toward the F-22s wasn't a helpless target. It was a predator, flown by a pilot who had spent 8 years learning how to make an obsolete aircraft do impossible things. Major Richards watched in disbelief as the A-10 climbed toward his F-22 at an angle that defied tactical logic. The Warthog pilot was giving up every advantage she had gained through 30 minutes of careful maneuvering, exposing her aircraft to a clear shot from either Raptor. "Viper 2, you seeing this?" he transmitted to Captain Davis. "Hog 1 is coming right at us. This is going to be easier than I thought." Richards rolled his F-22 into a diving turn, lining up for what should have been a simple head-on engagement. The Raptor's sophisticated fire control system automatically calculated intercept angles and weapon release parameters. All Richards had to do was wait for the target to enter his missile envelope and pull the trigger. But something was wrong with the picture developing in front of him. The A-10 wasn't flying like an aircraft trying to escape, or even like one trying to achieve a mutual kill. It was flying like a predator that had spotted prey. "Viper 1, something's not right here," Davis warned from his position several miles to the east. "That Warthog pilot knows something we don't." Richards was beginning to have the same thought, but momentum had already committed him to the engagement. The F-22 was diving toward the climbing A-10 at nearly Mach 1.2, and the physics of the situation meant he couldn't abort the attack without extending far beyond the exercise boundaries. What Richards couldn't see from his position high above the desert was the careful positioning that Sarah had achieved during her climb. The A-10 was no longer just flying toward the F-22s. It was climbing along a specific vector that would bring it into a unique tactical position. Sarah's hands moved across her aircraft's controls with practiced precision. The A-10's flight management system was decades older than the computers on the F-22, but it was also far simpler. Every switch, every lever, every button on her control panel had a specific function that she could activate without looking. During 8 years of flying combat missions, she had learned to operate her aircraft by touch and instinct. "Range 2 miles and closing," she murmured to herself, watching the F-22 grow larger in her canopy. The Raptor was a beautiful aircraft, all sharp angles and aggressive lines. It looked like exactly what it was, a purpose-built killing machine designed to dominate any aerial engagement. But beauty and lethality weren't the same thing. The F-22 pilot was making the classic mistake of confusing technological superiority with tactical advantage. He was flying his sophisticated aircraft like a simple interceptor, relying on speed and firepower to overwhelm his opponent. Sarah, meanwhile, was flying her A-10 like what it truly was, a combat aircraft designed to survive and win in the most hostile environments imaginable. 1 mile, she whispered. The F-22 was now close enough that she could make out details of its construction. The aircraft's stealth design created unusual shadow patterns as it moved through the desert air. At precisely the right moment, Sarah executed a maneuver that the F-22 pilot had probably never seen before. Instead of continuing her climb or attempting to turn away from the approaching fighter, she used the A-10's unique flight characteristics to perform what aerial combat veterans called a split-S with attitude. The rolled inverted and pulled through a vertical dive, but instead of completing the maneuver in a standard fashion, Sarah used her aircraft's exceptionally strong airframe to pull more G-force than any normal fighter pilot would attempt. The Warthog's titanium construction and redundant control systems allowed it to withstand structural stresses that would damage or destroy other aircraft. The result was a flight path that curved underneath and behind the diving F-22, putting the A-10 in the most advantageous position in air-to-air combat, on the enemy's tail, inside his turn radius, and in perfect position for a simulated weapons shot. "Guns, guns, guns," Sarah called out, announcing her simulated kill over the exercise frequency. "Viper 1, you're dead." The silence that followed lasted nearly 10 seconds. When Richards finally responded, his voice carried a mixture of shock and professional respect. "Confirm kill Hog 1, that was unexpected." "Viper 2, Hog 1, Sarah transmitted, addressing the remaining F-22. "Your wingman is down. You want to continue this dance." Captain Davis had watched the entire engagement from his position several miles away. The A-10 pilot had just accomplished something that shouldn't have been possible according to every manual he'd ever read. She had defeated an F-22 in air-to-air combat using nothing but superior tactics and an intimate knowledge of her aircraft's capabilities. "Negative, Hog 1, Davis replied. "I think you've made your point." But Sarah wasn't finished. The exercise parameters allowed for continued engagement as long as both sides were willing, and she had a demonstration to complete. "Bulldog Phase 3, she transmitted to Jake. "Copy, tank, beginning approach." Jake Torres brought his A-10 up from its hiding place in the desert terrain, but this time he wasn't running or hiding. He was attacking, climbing toward Davis's F-22 with the same aggressive tactics that Sarah had just used to defeat Richards. Davis found himself in an impossible situation. He could engage the approaching A-10, but that would require him to dive toward the target, potentially putting himself in the same vulnerable position that had just cost his wingman the fight. Alternatively, he could maintain his altitude advantage, but that would allow the A-10 to dictate the terms of engagement. "This is insane," Davis muttered to himself. "These are attack aircraft, not fighters." But the evidence was right in front of him. The A-10s were fighting like fighters, using tactics that exploited their unique strengths while negating the advantages of their more sophisticated opponents. Jake's approach differed slightly from Sarah's. Instead of a direct climb, he used a series of ascending spirals that made it difficult for the F-22 pilot to predict his exact flight path. The maneuver was energy neutral, meaning the A-10 neither gained nor lost significant speed or altitude, but it created a constantly changing tactical picture that forced the F-22 pilot to react rather than dictate. "Viper 2, recommend you extend and reset," Richards advised his wingman. The defeated F-22 pilot was still in the exercise area, observing the developing engagement between Davis and Jake. "Negative," Davis replied. "I'm not running from a Warthog." Pride was a dangerous thing in aerial combat. Davis committed to a head-on engagement with Jake's A-10, confident that his superior speed and weaponry would carry the day. He rolled the F-22 into a diving attack, following the same tactical approach that had just failed his wingman. Jake was ready for him. The A-10 pilot had been listening to the radio chatter between the two Raptor pilots, and he knew exactly what Davis would try. Instead of continuing his climb, Jake executed a maneuver that Sarah had taught him during countless training flights. The A-10 suddenly rolled inverted and pulled into a descending spiral that brought it behind and below the diving F-22. Jake used his aircraft's superior low-speed handling to maintain control, while Davis's Raptor, committed to its high-speed attack, overshot the engagement zone entirely. "Guns, guns, guns," Jake announced. "Viper 2, you're dead." The exercise was over. Two F-22 Raptors, representing the pinnacle of American fighter technology, had been defeated by a pair of A-10 Warthogs that most people considered obsolete. The debrief room at Nellis Air Force Base was unusually quiet as the four pilots filed in after their exercise. Normally, post-flight discussions were filled with good-natured ribbing and detailed analysis of tactical decisions. Today, the atmosphere was more subdued, colored by the unexpected outcome of the air-to-air engagement. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the exercise commander, stood at the front of the room with a tablet computer displaying radar tracks from the entire engagement. As the senior officer present, she would lead the official analysis of what had just transpired over the Nevada desert. "Gentlemen, lady," Colonel Hayes began, nodding towards Sarah, "I've been running red flag exercises for 8 years, and I can honestly say I've never seen anything quite like what happened out there today." Major Richards sat stiffly in his chair, his flight suit still damp with perspiration from the stress of combat maneuvering. The F-22 pilot was clearly struggling to process his defeat. In his 5 years flying the Raptor, he had never lost an air-to-air engagement, even during the most challenging training scenarios. "Colonel, I'd like to request a review of the exercise parameters," Richards said. I'm not convinced those A-10s were operating within normal flight envelopes. Some of those maneuvers seemed beyond the aircraft's design limitations. Sarah exchanged a glance with Jake before responding. Sir, every maneuver we performed today is documented in the A-10 flight manual. The aircraft was designed to withstand 7.33 G-forces, and we never exceeded 6.5 during the engagement. Captain Davis leaned forward in his seat. But those were attack aircraft engaging in air-to-air combat. That's not what they were designed for. Actually, Captain, Colonel Hayes interrupted, consulting her notes, the A-10 was specifically designed with air-to-air capability. The aircraft carries AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles and has a documented history of air-to-air kills. During Operation Desert Storm, A-10 pilots destroyed 2 Iraqi helicopters and several fixed-wing aircraft. Jake Torres spoke up for the first time since entering the debrief room. With respect, sirs, I think what happened today demonstrates something important about aerial combat. Technology is crucial, but it's not everything. Tactics, training, and knowing your aircraft's capabilities matter just as much. Colonel Hayes nodded approvingly. Captain Torres makes an excellent point. The F-22 is undoubtedly a superior air-to-air platform in most scenarios. Its stealth characteristics, advanced radar, and long-range missiles give it significant advantages in beyond visual range combat. She clicked to the next slide on her presentation, showing the radar tracks from the beginning of the engagement. However, what we saw today was an opponent who deliberately chose not to fight that kind of battle. Instead, the A-10 crews forced a close-range, low-altitude engagement where their aircraft's strengths could be maximized. Major Richards studied the tactical display. The radar tracks told a story that was becoming clearer in hindsight. The A-10 pilots had never intended to engage in traditional air-to-air combat. Instead, they had created a completely different kind of fight, one where the F-22's advantages were minimized while the Warthog's unique characteristics became decisive factors. I have to ask, Richards said, looking directly at Sarah, how did you know those tactics would work? Sarah smiled slightly. I didn't know for certain, sir. But I've spent 8 years flying the A-10, and I've studied every air-to-air engagement involving Warthogs in the historical record. The aircraft has capabilities that most people don't understand because they've never had to use them. She stood and walked to the tactical display. The A-10 was designed during the Cold War, when planners expected it to operate in the most hostile airspace imaginable. Every system on the aircraft was built with redundancy and survivability in mind. That included the ability to defend itself against enemy fighters. Captain Davis was beginning to understand. So you used the aircraft's ground attack capabilities in an air-to-air role. The low-altitude maneuvering, the terrain masking, the ability to absorb damage and keep fighting. Exactly. But more than that, we used the fact that most fighter pilots have never trained against A-10s in air-to-air combat. Your tactics were optimized for engaging other fast-moving, high-altitude targets. We deliberately chose to fight a different kind of battle. Colonel Hayes advanced to another slide showing fuel consumption and weapons expenditure during the exercise. There's another factor worth discussing. The F-22s burned significantly more fuel than the A-10s during this engagement. In a real combat situation, the Raptors would have had to return to base or rendezvous with tanker aircraft much sooner. This was a point that Sarah had hoped would emerge during the debrief. The A-10's fuel efficiency and long loiter time were often overlooked in discussions of aerial combat, but they were significant tactical advantages. The Warthog could stay in a fight much longer than faster, more fuel-hungry aircraft. There's also the psychological factor, Jake added. Most pilots expect A-10s to run away from fighter aircraft. When we turned and fought instead, it changed the entire dynamic of the engagement. Major Richards was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had heard. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of professional respect that hadn't been there before the exercise. Captain Mitchell, I owe you an apology. This morning, I said the A-10 was obsolete. What you demonstrated today proves that pilot skill and tactical innovation can overcome technological advantages. That's a lesson I won't forget. Sarah nodded graciously. Thank you, sir. But I hope the real lesson here is that every aircraft in the Air Force inventory exists for a reason. The F-22 is an incredible air superiority fighter, and there are missions where it would defeat any opponent. Today, we just showed that the A-10 has its own unique capabilities. Colonel Hayes closed her tablet and looked around the room. This exercise will be written up as a case study for the Air War College. The tactics demonstrated by the A-10 crews represent innovative thinking that could be applied to other asymmetric combat scenarios. She paused, considering her next words carefully. But I want to be clear about something. What happened today doesn't prove that A-10s are better air-to-air platforms than F-22s. What it proves is that in the right circumstances, with the right tactics, any aircraft can be dangerous if it's flown by pilots who understand its capabilities. The debrief session continued for another hour, with detailed analysis of each phase of the engagement. By the time it ended, the four pilots had developed a mutual respect that transcended the rivalry between different aircraft communities. As they walked out of the building, Major Richards approached Sarah one more time. "Captain, would you be interested in doing some cross-training? I think my squadron could learn a lot from your approach to tactical thinking." Sarah smiled. "I'd be honored, sir, and maybe you could show us some of those high-altitude intercept techniques. There's always something to learn from other communities." The rivalry between fast jets and slow jets would continue, but today had proven that in aerial combat, the pilot was often more important than the plane. 3 months after the exercise at Nellie's, Sarah Tank, Mitchell found herself standing in front of a packed auditorium at the Air War College in Montgomery, Alabama. Word of the A-10 versus F-22 engagement had spread throughout the Air Force, generating intense interest from tactical training communities around the world. The presentation she was about to give had been requested by the Chief of Staff of the Air Force himself. In an era of budget constraints and political pressure to retire older aircraft, the exercise had demonstrated something that Pentagon officials needed to understand: the value of preserving diverse capabilities within the military's arsenal. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, looking out at an audience that included generals, colonels, and tactical experts from multiple branches of the military. 3 months ago, my wingman and I participated in what we thought was a routine training exercise. What happened that day has changed how many of us think about aerial combat in the modern era. The large screen behind her displayed a tactical map of the Nevada exercise area, complete with radar tracks showing the movements of all 4 aircraft during the engagement. The audience leaned forward, studying the data with professional interest. The question that many people have asked is simple: how did 2 supposedly obsolete attack aircraft defeat 2 of the world's most advanced fighters? The answer lies not in technology, but in understanding the difference between capability and application. Sarah clicked to the next slide, which showed comparative specifications for the A-10 and F-22. On paper, the Raptor's superiority was overwhelming. Faster, stealthier, and armed with more sophisticated weapons, it should have dominated any engagement with the older aircraft. Major Richards and Captain Davis did nothing wrong during our exercise. They flew their F-22s exactly as they had been trained, using tactics that have proven successful in countless engagements. Their mistake was assuming that all opponents would fight according to the same tactical doctrine they had learned. In the audience, Major Richards nodded thoughtfully. The F-22 pilot had become an unexpected ally in promoting the lessons learned from their encounter. His willingness to discuss his defeat had earned respect throughout the fighter community and had contributed to significant changes in training programs. The A-10 community has always known that our aircraft is different. We can't run away from threats, so we've learned to think differently about survival and mission accomplishment. That mindset proved to be our greatest weapon against technologically superior opponents. Sarah advanced to a slide showing historical examples of asymmetric warfare, from ancient battles to modern conflicts. Military history is filled with examples of supposedly inferior forces defeating superior ones through innovative tactics and superior knowledge of terrain and conditions. What we demonstrated over Nevada was simply an aerial application of principles that have existed for thousands of years. General Patricia Morrison, the Air War College commandant, raised her hand. "Captain Mitchell, some critics have suggested that your tactics would only work in a controlled training environment. How do you respond to the argument that real combat would favor the more advanced aircraft?" Sarah had expected this question. "General, that's a fair point, and I won't pretend that our success guarantees the same outcome in every scenario. However, I would argue that real combat conditions might actually favor the A-10 in some situations. She clicked to a new slide showing combat statistics from various conflicts. The A-10 was designed to operate in contested airspace, taking damage and continuing to fight. In a real engagement, the F-22's stealth advantages might be reduced by electronic warfare, weather conditions, or the presence of multiple threat types. The presentation continued for another 20 minutes, covering detailed analysis of the tactical decisions made during the exercise. Sarah explained how she and Jake had used terrain masking, timing, and unconventional maneuvers to negate the F-22's technological advantages. But the most important lesson from our experience isn't tactical, Sarah concluded. It's strategic. The Air Force's strength comes from diversity of capabilities. Every aircraft type in our inventory exists because it fills a unique role that other platforms can't replicate. She paused, looking directly at the senior officers in the front row. The temptation to focus on the newest, most advanced technology is understandable. But combat effectiveness isn't just about having the best individual platforms. It's about having the right mix of capabilities to handle any situation that might arise. After the presentation, Sarah was approached by dozens of officers eager to discuss the tactical implications of her demonstration. Among them was Colonel Michael Chen, the commander of an F-35 Lightning II squadron. "Captain Mitchell," Colonel Chen said, "I've been thinking about your demonstration, and I wonder if similar tactics could be applied to other aircraft types. The F-35 isn't as fast as the F-22, but it has some unique capabilities that might benefit from unconventional tactical thinking." Sarah smiled. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that needs to happen, sir. Every aircraft has strengths that can be exploited if you're creative enough to find them." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Major Richards, who had flown in specifically to attend Sarah's presentation. The F-22 pilot had become something of a celebrity within the Air Force, though not for the reasons he had originally intended. "Tank," Richards said, using Sarah's call sign with the familiarity of shared combat experience. "I've been implementing some of your tactical concepts with my squadron. We're calling it Adaptive Engagement Doctrine, and it's changing how we think about air-to-air combat." "How so?" Sarah asked. "We're training our pilots to expect the unexpected. Instead of relying solely on our technological advantages, we're emphasizing tactical flexibility and the ability to adapt to unconventional opponents. Your demonstration proved that any enemy who's smart enough to study our capabilities can potentially develop countermeasures." This was perhaps the most significant outcome of their Nevada encounter. The exercise had forced the Air Force's premier fighter community to reconsider some of its basic assumptions about aerial combat. Training programs were being revised to include scenarios involving unconventional tactics and asymmetric threats. 6 months later, Sarah received orders to join a special project at the Pentagon. Her new assignment involved developing tactical doctrine for mixed aircraft formations, combining the unique capabilities of different platforms to create more effective combat teams. The project was inspired by the lessons learned from her encounter with the F-22s. Military planners were beginning to understand that the future of aerial warfare might depend less on having the most advanced individual aircraft and more on creating synergistic combinations of different capabilities. On her final day at her old squadron, Sarah stood next to her, on the flight line, watching the sun set over the desert. The aircraft looked exactly the same as it had on the day of the famous exercise, but everything else had changed. The obsolete Warthog had proven that experience, creativity, and tactical innovation could overcome technological superiority. More importantly, it had reminded the Air Force that diversity of capabilities was a strength, not a weakness. Jake Torres approached, carrying his flight helmet under his arm. "You know what I think the best part of all this is?" he asked. "What's that, Bulldog?" "Those F-22 guys have stopped calling us slow. Now they just call us sneaky." Sarah laughed. "I can live with sneaky." As they walked toward the squadron building, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that morning when she had overheard Major Richards questioning the A-10's relevance. The exercise that followed had become more than just a training event. It had become a demonstration of principles that applied far beyond aerial combat. The importance of innovation, the value of diverse perspectives, and the truth that in any contest between opponents, victory often belonged to the side that was willing to fight differently. The A-10 Warthog might never be as fast or as stealthy as newer aircraft, but it had proven something equally important. In the hands of skilled pilots who understood its capabilities, even an obsolete aircraft could accomplish extraordinary things.